They say no one ever looks through their window expecting to see something staring back. I wasn't expecting it either, but now I can't sleep without wondering if it's still out there, watching me. Ethan Kane wasn't the type to scare easily. At least, that's what he'd always told himself. He was the guy who scoffed at urban legends, rolled his eyes at ghost stories, and found horror movies amusing rather than frightening. But standing in his dimly lit living room, staring at the woods outside his window, he felt something he hadn't in years: fear. The figure had been there again, just like the night before. A vague, dark silhouette lurking just far enough into the tree line that he could convince himself it wasn't real, if only for a moment. Ethan closed the blinds with a snap and muttered under his breath, "Just the shadows, nothing more." But he didn't believe it. Not really. Ethan had moved to this quiet suburban neighborhood 6 months ago. After years of living in the relentless noise of the city, he'd had enough. Enough of the deadlines, the backstabbing colleagues, the endless cycle of meaningless relationships. His breakup with Mia had been the final nail in the coffin. "You need to figure yourself out, Ethan," Mia had told him as she packed her things. "You've got all this potential, but you're too scared to do anything with it. You're always stuck in your own head." Before we dive deeper into this chilling story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more terrifying tales you won't want to miss. Let's get back to it. Her words stung, mostly because they were true. Ethan was a man who played it safe, always had. He avoided risks, kept his world small, and stayed in his comfort zone. Moving to this little house on the edge of the woods was supposed to be his fresh start, a chance to quiet the noise and rebuild his life on his terms. By day, Ethan worked remotely as a copywriter, drafting ad campaigns and slogans for companies he didn't care about. By night, he distracted himself with books, podcasts, and the occasional late-night Netflix binge. He told himself he was content, even though the silence of his new life sometimes felt suffocating. The first time Ethan saw it, he'd been sitting at his desk near the window, nursing a cup of cold coffee. It was past midnight, and the world outside was still. He was wrapping up a project when something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in the woods. At first, he thought it was a deer. The area was full of them, and they often wandered into backyards in search of food. But as he looked closer, he realized this wasn't a deer. The figure was tall, impossibly tall and motionless. It stood among the trees, just barely illuminated by the glow of the moon. Its shape was human, or at least close to human, but something about it was off. Its limbs seemed too long, its posture unnaturally stiff. Ethan had stared at it for what felt like minutes, waiting for it to move, to prove it was alive. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching. When Ethan finally blinked, the figure was gone. The next morning, Ethan chalked it up to exhaustion. He'd been working late, hadn't slept well, and his mind was playing tricks on him. That's what he told himself anyway. But a part of him couldn't shake the image of that figure in the woods. As the week went on, Ethan found himself glancing out the window more often. During the day, the woods looked harmless, a tangle of trees and underbrush, the kind of scenery he'd found calming when he first moved here. But at night, it took on a different quality. The shadows seemed darker, deeper, as if something was hiding in them. On the third night, he saw it again. This time, the figure was closer, standing just beyond the edge of his backyard. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, he knew better. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But Ethan could feel its attention, its presence. It was as if the thing were studying him, waiting for something. After that, Ethan couldn't ignore it anymore. He bought motion-activated floodlights and installed them around the house, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. But the lights never caught anything. They stayed dark, even on the nights Ethan knew he'd seen the figure. Sleep became a rare luxury. Ethan would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear the slightest sound from outside. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. He tried talking to his neighbor, an older man named Harold who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. "Probably just a prank," Harold said dismissively when Ethan brought it up. "Kids around here get bored, especially this time of year." But Harold's eyes betrayed him. When Ethan described the figure in the woods, Harold's face paled slightly, and he quickly changed the subject. On the fifth night, Ethan found the handprints. It had rained earlier that evening, and the ground outside was damp and muddy. Ethan was sitting in the living room, staring at the TV but not really watching, when he heard a faint tapping sound. He froze, his pulse quickening. The sound was coming from the window behind him. Slowly, he turned around. The blinds were down, but the tapping continued, soft, deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers on the glass. Summoning his courage, Ethan walked to the window and lifted the blinds. There was nothing there. But when he stepped outside the next morning, he saw them. A pair of muddy handprints on the glass, just at eye level. The prints were strange. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow, as if they'd been made by something trying to mimic human hands, but not quite getting it right. That was when Ethan realized this wasn't something he could explain away. This wasn't just his imagination or a prank. Something was out there, and it wasn't going to leave him alone. By the end of the week, Ethan was a shell of his former self. The confident, rational man who had moved here for a fresh start was gone, replaced by someone jumpy and paranoid, someone who double-checked the locks 3 times before bed and flinched at every noise. He couldn't help but feel like the thing in the woods was playing with him, testing his limits. And as he stared out the window that night, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was only just beginning. Because now, Ethan didn't just see the twisted man, he felt him. And he knew, deep down, that the thing outside his window wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. Ethan didn't go outside anymore. Not after the handprints. He told himself he needed to focus on work, that deadlines didn't care about his personal life. But when the truth was too loud to ignore, he admitted it. The thought of stepping into his backyard, or even opening a window, made his stomach churn. But staying inside wasn't much better. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the silence felt sharper now, like it had teeth. But he couldn't call anyone about it. What would he even say? That something unnatural was lurking outside his house? That he could feel its eyes on him every night? The police wouldn't believe him. They'd send a patrol car to drive by, maybe tell him to invest in security cameras. It wouldn't help. Nothing would help. So he stayed inside, locked doors, and closed blinds. But no matter what he did, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the twisted man was waiting, watching. The next time Ethan saw the twisted man, it wasn't in the woods. He had been pacing his kitchen, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had become his constant companion. Then he heard it, the faint creak of a floorboard coming from the living room. At first, he froze. He told himself it was just the house settling. But the sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Ethan grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a kitchen knife, and crept toward the living room. His heart was pounding so loudly that he barely heard the sound of his own footsteps. Then he saw it. In the dim light spilling in from the kitchen, the corner of the room looked wrong. The shadows didn't sit where they should have. Something was standing there, motionless, blending into the darkness. But as Ethan stared, the shape became clearer. It was the twisted man. Ethan's breath caught. Its body was too long, its arms hanging unnaturally low. The face was pale, almost featureless, except for the twisted smile that stretched across its mouth. But its eyes, black, sunken pits, locked onto Ethan with a terrible intensity. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the twisted man melted back into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. Ethan spent the rest of the night in his bedroom with the knife clutched in his shaking hands. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. By morning, his exhaustion had given way to a frantic need for answers. He turned to the internet, typing in every combination of words he could think of. Tall figure woods, creature outside window, long arms, twisted smile. The search results were a mess of conspiracy theories, urban legends, and amateur ghost hunting forums. But one post caught his eye. It was buried deep in a thread about local folklore. The title was simple, The Twisted Man. The user claimed that the twisted man wasn't just a story. It was real. According to the post, the twisted man was an ancient entity tied to the woods, a being that fed on fear and isolation. Once it marked someone, It wouldn't stop until it broke them completely. The user described seeing the same figure, long limbs, twisted smile, and black, empty eyes, and said it only appeared at night. But there was one detail that made Ethan's stomach turn. The post warned against looking directly into the twisted man's eyes. Doing so would create a connection, something the entity could exploit. Ethan slammed his laptop shut, bile rising in his throat. He had already looked into its eyes. Desperate for clarity, Ethan decided to confront Harold. He didn't trust many people in the neighborhood, but Harold had lived here the longest. If anyone knew the truth, it was him. But when Ethan knocked on Harold's door, it took an unusually long time for the old man to answer. When he finally did, his face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the doorframe. "You look like hell, son," Harold said, his voice low. "I need to ask you something," Ethan said, his words spilling out in a rush. "The thing in the woods, the twisted man, you know about it, don't you?" Harold stiffened. For a moment, Ethan thought he would slam the door in his face, but then the old man sighed and stepped aside, motioning for Ethan to come in. Inside, Harold poured himself a glass of whiskey and offered one to Ethan, who declined. "I hoped I was wrong about you," Harold said after a long silence. "Hoped it wouldn't come for you." "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking. Harold's eyes were distant, haunted. "It's a curse, plain and simple. Been around longer than anyone can remember. It doesn't go after just anyone, though. It picks people. People like you." "People like me?" Harold nodded. "Lonely, isolated, carrying just enough fear in their hearts to feed it. Once it marks you, there's no getting rid of it. It'll make you see things, hear things. It'll wear you down until there's nothing left of you." Ethan felt the weight of Harold's words settle on his chest. "But why me?" Harold didn't answer. He just stared into his whiskey glass, his knuckles white. When Ethan left Harold's house, the sun was already setting. The streets were empty, the air cold and still. He hurried back to his own home, locking the door behind him and double-checking the windows. But even as he tried to distract himself with work, Harold's words replayed in his mind. Lonely, isolated, carrying just enough fear to feed it. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Harold was right. He had moved here to escape the noise of the city, to rebuild his life after Mia left. But instead of starting over, he had withdrawn further into himself, cutting off the world completely. He had been alone for months, his only companions the books and screens that filled the empty spaces of his days. And now, the twisted man had found him. Ethan didn't mean to look out the window that night. He had told himself not to. Had even dragged a chair in front of the blinds to stop himself from peeking. But something compelled him, a gnawing curiosity that refused to let go. He moved the chair aside and lifted the blinds just an inch, enough to see outside. At first, the backyard was empty, but then he noticed the shadows shifting near the edge of the woods. And there it was. The twisted man was standing there, just beyond the glow of the motion lights. It didn't move, but its head was tilted slightly, as if it were studying him. Ethan knew he should look away, but he couldn't. His eyes locked onto the figure's face, onto the grotesque smile that seemed wider than it should have been. And then it happened. The twisted man's head twitched, its mouth opening slightly as if it were about to speak. But instead of words, Ethan heard a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through his entire body. He stumbled back from the window, his heart racing, and slammed the blinds shut. But the sound didn't stop. It echoed in his ears, even as he pressed his hands over them, trying to block it out. That was when Ethan realized the twisted man wasn't just outside anymore. It was in his head. Ethan didn't remember falling asleep. He woke with a start, sprawled on the living room floor, his heart pounding as though he'd been running. The knife he'd taken to bed the night before was still clutched in his hand, the metal cold against his palm. The last thing he remembered was the sound, the guttural, bone-deep vibration that had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But now the house was silent. Too silent. Ethan slowly got to his feet, wincing as his joints protested. His eyes flicked to the window, the blinds still drawn tightly shut. He didn't dare look outside again, not after last night. But that didn't stop the feeling, the terrible certainty that it was still there. The twisted man wasn't going to leave. The day passed in a haze. Ethan tried to lose himself in work, but the words on the screen blurred together, meaningless. He hadn't eaten, hadn't showered, hadn't done anything except sit in that chair, staring blankly at the computer while his mind spiraled. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe Harold was wrong. Maybe this thing was just a hallucination, a symptom of his isolation and stress. But every time he tried to convince himself, he remembered the muddy handprints, the sound, the way the twisted man's eyes had bored into him as though it could see every thought, every fear, every dark corner of his soul. And there was something else. Something Ethan hadn't wanted to admit, even to himself. The house felt different now, smaller, colder. It was as though the walls had shifted, the air inside heavy and oppressive, pressing down on him like a physical weight. It wasn't just the twisted man haunting him, it was the house itself. By evening, Ethan couldn't stand it anymore. He needed answers, needed to understand what was happening. And Harold was the only one who could help him. Ethan threw on a jacket and bolted out the door, ignoring the way the shadows in his backyard seemed to writhe at the edge of his vision. He crossed the street to Harold's house, pounding on the door with a desperation that bordered on hysteria. It took longer than it should have for Harold to answer. When the door finally creaked open, Ethan's stomach dropped. Harold looked worse than he had before. Pale, gaunt, and trembling, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. "You shouldn't have come here," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know," Ethan said, forcing the words out. "What does it want? How do I stop it?" Harold hesitated, his gaze darting nervously over Ethan's shoulder, as though he expected the twisted man to appear at any moment. Then he sighed, stepping aside to let Ethan in. "Sit down," Harold said, pouring himself another glass of whiskey. He didn't offer Ethan one this time. "You're not the first, you know? The first person it's marked." Ethan's stomach churned. "What happens to the others?" Harold didn't answer right away. He took a long sip of his drink, his hand shaking. "Some of them vanish," he said finally. "Others, they lose their minds, start seeing things that aren't there, hearing things. They'll lose themselves completely until there's nothing left but fear. And that's when it takes them." Ethan leaned forward, his voice trembling. "Takes them where?" Harold shook his head, his expression grim. "Nobody knows. All I've heard are stories. Some say it drags them into the woods, into some other place. Others say it feeds on them until there's nothing left but a hollow shell. But one thing's for sure. Once the twisted man's in your head, it doesn't let go." Ethan's breath quickened. He thought about the sound, that horrible vibration, and the way it had lingered in his mind. "It's already in my head," he whispered. Harold's face darkened. "Then you don't have much time." Ethan didn't know how he got back to his house. The walk home was a blur, his thoughts racing in a chaotic loop. He couldn't let this thing take him. He couldn't let himself become another story, another warning for some future victim. But what could he do? Harold had offered no solutions, no hope, just grim inevitability. The twisted man thrived on fear. That much was clear. And if it was in his head, feeding on his thoughts, then maybe the only way to fight it was to take away its power. Ethan sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. He began typing furiously, pouring everything out, every encounter, every feeling, every twisted detail of what he'd seen. He didn't care if it sounded crazy. Maybe if he shared his story, if he brought it into the light, he could take back some control. But as the hours passed, the air around him grew heavier, colder. The words on the screen blurred, the letters shifting and twisting into nonsense. Ethan blinked hard, rubbing his eyes, but it didn't help. The screen was empty now, the text he'd written erased. And then he felt it. The room was silent, but Ethan knew he wasn't alone. He could feel it. The presence that had been lurking at the edges of his vision, the thing that had haunted his nights, was finally here. He turned slowly, his heart pounding so loudly it felt like it would burst. The twisted man stood in the corner of the room, its grotesque form taller than the ceiling should have allowed. Its head tilted unnaturally, the twisted smile stretching wider than ever. Ethan's mouth went dry. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there frozen in place. But then the twisted man moved. Its long, spindly arms reached out, its fingers curling and uncurling as it stepped closer. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to look away, to break the connection, but he couldn't. Those black, sunken eyes held him captive. pulling him deeper into their endless void. And then the Twisted Man spoke. Its voice wasn't a sound, but a sensation, a low, vibrating hum that echoed in Ethan's skull. It wasn't words exactly, but he understood it all the same. It was telling him everything. Every mistake, every failure, every fear he'd tried to bury. It was showing him his own mind, twisted and distorted, feeding on the darkest parts of himself. Ethan clutched his head, trying to drown out the noise, the overwhelming pressure that threatened to crush him. "Get out of my head!" he screamed, his voice cracking. But the Twisted Man didn't stop. Its smile grew wider, its presence more suffocating. Ethan's vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he was going to pass out. But then he remembered something Harold had said. It thrives on fear. With a sudden burst of clarity, Ethan forced himself to focus. He stood up, his legs shaking, and stared directly into the Twisted Man's eyes. "You don't control me," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "You only have power because I let you. I'm done being afraid of you." For a moment, nothing happened. The Twisted Man stood still, its smile faltering ever so slightly, and then it began to change. The figure twisted and contorted, its form shifting into something smaller, weaker. Its once imposing presence shrank until it was nothing more than a shadow on the floor. And then, it was gone. Ethan collapsed onto the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. The house felt different now, lighter, warmer, as though a weight had been lifted. But even as relief washed over him, he knew the Twisted Man wasn't truly gone. It was still out there, waiting for its next victim. Ethan turned back to his laptop and began typing again. This time the words stayed. He would share his story, warn others, and fight back the only way he knew how. Because the Twisted Man fed on fear, and as long as people knew the truth, they could fight it too. Ethan uploaded his story online that night, hitting publish with trembling fingers. He didn't know if anyone would believe him, but he had to try. And as he stared at the darkened window across the room, he thought he saw a flicker of movement in the glass. The Twisted Man was still watching, but this time, Ethan wasn't afraid. If you found this story chilling and thought-provoking, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling tales like this one. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And tell us in the comments, how would you handle an encounter with something like the Twisted Man? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember, some shadows aren't cast by the light.